afternoon, everyone. So you have the option to just stand for a second and just have a stretch. So don't feel like you have to participate. If you want to stand, just kind of get your rocks out. There you go. And then you can see again. Everyone's waiting. I mean, you know. I didn't mean you could leave the room. So I'm Jason. I'm the founder of Collider International, and we are a fully inclusive B2B marketplace pretenders. We really focus on supply diversity. A bit of a background about myself. I worked in financial services for about 23 years. Now, it was 11 years within investment banks. I was at JP Morgan for 5 years, for example. Then about 12 or so years working in sales, selling technology back to banks, asset managers, hedge funds, and always found the sales process to be quite difficult. You make 12,000 phone calls a year, 50 calls a day. You send hundreds of emails, do tens of meetings, and you still can't get through the front door to these buyers who are trying to buy a brand new product or service. Or they say, call back next week. You called on Tuesday and already bought something on Monday. You always seem to miss it. But when you do get in that front door, when you do have the opportunity to present, when you are stood in front of a crowd presenting, I often found that there was no representation in the rooms in the sector that I worked in, financial services. There was no one who was black or ethnic minority who was in a senior executive position. And you can imagine being a woman, for example, trying to sell a construction service in a room full of men. I really began to explore unconscious bias, and I speak a lot about unconscious bias. And today I'm going to take the conversation just a bit further into the future of supply diversity. But my encounter with supply with unconscious bias helps me to understand that whilst people buy from people, and can sometimes be impacted by affinity bias as well, those biases impact or create a problem with it, create imposter syndrome within the actual supplier themselves. And so supply diversity is very personal for me because it allows people who are talented, who are competent, to have an opportunity to present themselves and pitch their business and be successful. So my appreciation goes to all the organizations, to the GSA, to Accenture, and all the companies that actually work with diverse suppliers. But I want to kind of start at the end of my presentation first than the beginning, which is really to focus on, I guess, a conclusion that the purpose of supply diversity is to create access to opportunities. But what we saw in the US recently, early this year and towards the end of last year, was a ruling from the Supreme Court that imposed, perhaps, I got the word in here, it removed diversity as a criteria for scholarships, for instance, right? So PwC were taken to court, as have Harvard been taken to court, because they had scholarship programs that focused on providing access to scholarships for the Black community. And as we know through previous presentation, supply diversity started with the civil rights movement through affirmative action. And that's where the access to scholarships, for example, were made possible and available to the African American community. But what we saw as a result of this ruling, which basically invalidated the race-conscious affirmative action, was PwC were taken to court as well because of their scholarship, and they had to then reverse all of their diverse focus efforts. For example, they abandoned their 40% spend commitment to spending ethnic minority and African American owned businesses. From a supply diversity standpoint in the UK, we're probably like 22 or 25 years into supply diversity, thanks to MSD UK and Mayank and now Reshma, who was leading the front on that. But there's a risk that we might adopt some of the challenges or concerns that have come from the US. What we do know is that where from 2003, when the Supreme Court made that ruling, and the PwC took action in 2024, in the UK, what we've had in 2012 is the Public Sector Act, which really focused on sustainability. More, however, in 2023, we've had the Procurement Act, which had a focus on social value, but didn't go as far enough to talk about supply diversity. Now, the umbrella for SMEs will cover diverse suppliers, typically where you find diverse suppliers. But there's a conversation to be had amongst those who are running supply diversity programs. If, from the US, that we've seen the changes that happen in the US, will that change impact the efforts that are applied to supply diversity over here in the UK and across the EMEA territory? What's fascinating, however, was what Jamie Dimon said. Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan. when asked about his approach or interpretation of the Supreme Court ruling, he said, we've got to follow the law, but we can't deny that there are some communities that still require help, still require support, and we've got to be clever about how we do that. So I certainly encourage all organizations to continue to with their programs. There's no ruling over here in the UK that would impact that, but there's certainly an opportunity for us to learn how do we apply supply diversity programs or efforts across our individual businesses. So the UK policy makers have a case study on what to perhaps consider when writing their own policies. And like I said, in the 2023 Procurement Act, it didn't go far enough to talk about diverse suppliers, which is actually a positive thing. Now, when I think about it, before I was slightly concerned that there was an opportunity to actually make a statement. But as we see what happened in the US when those statements are made, some people it doesn't make allies and advocates of everyone. So one thing we can actually do within the UK is really understand how to write inclusive policy. Now, as a business, we are fully inclusive. I'm a 6'5" black man. In those rooms where there's no representation, I feel like I stand out. But my wife is white. My daughter's a mixed race. I've hired people who are in the LGBTQ community. Having something which is inclusive really helps organizations foster more inclusive procurement processes in their businesses themselves. And you move to, instead of focusing on race exclusive policies, instead you can move to more innovative job creation and economic growth style policies when looking at those businesses within the SME umbrella. One of the key things from a supply diversity perspective is really leveraging technology and advocacy groups that make opportunities to the diverse suppliers accessible as possible. We often say in our business that exclusive is not inclusive. And so when we move to a position where maybe perhaps there may be a criteria around the social economic status of an individual, where races or gender or sexuality is no longer considered, instead perhaps who are the impacted individuals that we're trying to help? And are those individuals, I mean, I know that there are, white young men in Liverpool who experience discrimination and poverty, who also require help as well. So how do we move away from and move to support those communities that are disenfranchised, that experience marginalization, that do need help and support, whilst also capturing those in that same umbrella of opportunity and access to opportunity by those who are socially, economically disadvantaged as well. I guess I was going to start at the end of my brief talk here in the interest of time, was that really the opportunity here is to create an opportunity to build an innovative and inclusive approach to supply diversity. When we look at how the US are having to roll back where they were and what they've done in the past, in a room where I think a lot of the time some people can feel they then themselves are experiencing bias themselves. And instead of making them allies and advocates, they now become adversaries instead of people who actually should be advocating for equality across all walks of life. The UK has an opportunity to now consider, and has been considering, that the inclusive approach to supply diversity, as opposed to a race-focused supply diversity, is probably one of the strongest ways to go forward and build innovation and be innovative. So the focus is on inclusiveness and not necessarily exclusive sourcing. And yeah, that's what I want to share with you today, that approach.
Got a question for Jason before we move on to the panel.
I wasn't that clear. There's a question. Come on.
One thing is that I think thankfully in the US, PwC is not a great example, but there's also companies, corporations that I've heard that say, well, let them come, we'll go to court. Just let them take us to court because we're going to continue. So I just want to say that, let's not think that everything in the US is now going to be bad now Trump selected. I think still corporations and people within corporations still want this, and they are ready to fight for it. So
yeah, I think that there was a concern from people who experience some fatigue around diversity and inclusion programs. We've seen across the UK some cities have removed spend from diversity and inclusion project and programs within their counties. And so if there is some fatigue across some of the communities, some of the boroughs, some of the councils, I guess the message is to continue to think about those who are marginalised, whether you be neurodivergent, disabled, visibly or invisibly disabled, ethnic minorities, the whole community and spectrum of supply diversity, to consider to, consider to make those the point of focus, particularly in the UK, despite those programs.
And 85% of the businesses in the US are still owned by white men. So
Yeah,
that's the problem.
yeah, exactly.
I might end up saying it panel shortly, but I really hate the word supplier diversity now. The word diversity in itself is misleading. It divides us. I'm using the word inclusive procurement a lot more. It's about including everyone. And when you talk about the US, the whole cut and paste model from the US to UK, it can't work. Our ecosystem here is so different. Supply diversity, inclusive procurement is about making your supply chain, de-risking your supply chain, going out and finding businesses you normally wouldn't with those brilliant ideas that you said. So it's all about the terminology, but then the terminology influences the mindset, and that's why I'm, as far as the US and the UK, I think the UK is special. I love your business name because I do think my superpower is the fact I'm different. And as you said, you go into rooms that you normally don't, and you stand out. So I could talk for England, so I've stopped now. But
I found that a lot of businesses, they tend to ask, well, why do we need a supply diversity program? They answer that question. It's really quite hard to answer in a way that someone will understand. What we began to do is we developed an AI toolkit, which you give us a company house number and it tells you if it's a woman-owned business or an ethnic minority-owned business. We can do that now through algorithmic intelligence. The reason why we do that is because we can evidence that you've already got diverse suppliers. You've already made profit. You're already using those supply chains to satisfy customers. And when you kind of present it from that perspective, those detractors in that room begin to say, oh, I actually understand now that we're not trying to do anything which is revolutionary or different from a change our business model. Actual fact, they're already bringing us value. They're already helping us to make profit. And so sometimes people need the evidence and to, I guess, inverse the actual presentation in a sense to kind of give a different perspective and then tackle the problems and challenges and questions differently. But you're already doing this. So, all right, thanks. I'll keep going.